Coming up, we dive in with another great conversation with friend of the show, Howard Beck, who's going to be breaking down what it could look like for the Nets to be involved with the Damian Lillard trade, if that expands them beyond just wanting to acquire Tyler Herro and other expiring contracts that could be out there on the market, and ultimately, have the Brooklyn Nets and Sean Marks accomplished what they set out to do a week into free agency, with still certainly more moves to potentially be made? We break it all down coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast, and your New Jersey Devils on the Devils Puck Luck podcast. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We are free on all those great platforms, and as promised, we dive right in on the discussion with Howard Beck. All right, as always, and maybe for the last time, we're excited to welcome back in Howard Beck. Obviously, you know him formerly of SI, also Bleacher Report and the New York Times, now a contributor for GQ Sports and this very network, the Locked On Network. Howard, how are we? How have you been in a very busy offseason for the NBA?
Doing great, Adam. Thank you. Good to be with you. And yes, this may just be my Locked On finale, at least for now. We'll see what the future holds, but of course, always happy to come back and hang out with you anytime in the future.
This isn't reflective on me or the Locked On Nets podcast, Howard. This was in the works before we got on today.
To be very, very clear, yes, I had a short-term arrangement with Mr. Locke and the network, which we had agreed a few months back would run through the first week of free agency, and here we are. We are on the verge of, so we're just about a week in, and we're on the verge of the moratorium ending and all that flood of contracts actually being final. But yes, this was always going to be the end point for me in my official arrangement with the Locked On Network. It doesn't mean I couldn't unofficially come back, chat with you, maybe do some hockey pods. I don't know anything about hockey, but what the heck, you know?
Why not?
Sure.
Yeah, throw them on the plate. If you're interested, water polo, I think, is the next thing that Howard would like to tackle.
Locked On water polo, I hear, is doing bonkers traffic.
That's right. You always got to be looking to move upward to bigger and better projects.
Locked On pickleball. How is there not a Locked On pickleball yet?
I don't want to get behind the scenes here, but yes, my co-host Doug Norrie and I are exploring the pickleball courts as we speak. We're getting very active as we move through our late 30s. It's important. You got to keep those legs limber.
Absolutely.
All right, let's not go ahead and then waste one of the final potential appearances for Howard Beck. Obviously, the biggest narrative overall in the NBA free agency is Damian Lillard and what's going to happen there. It seems like a foregone conclusion that that's Miami. That's what he's forcing. It's what his agents are forcing. And now it's just about these second, third teams that are going to get involved and how the mechanics are going to work out. When you hear that the Brooklyn Nets are potentially interested in being the third team that could end up with, as a byproduct, Tyler Herro on their roster, are they actively, in your mind, pursuing this trade to be the third team? Or is this the fallout of at one point being rumored to maybe actually be getting Damian Lillard to the Brooklyn Nets?
I'll start with this, and I don't want to derail us. If people want to hear my complete presentation on this particular point, you can go look up the Locked On Heat appearance that I did yesterday.
Yes.
But I don't think it's some done deal or absolute certainty that Damian Lillard ends up with the Heat. He doesn't have a no-trade clause. He's not a walk-away free agent. He's got 4 years left on his deal. He has far less leverage than his camp, and I think the Heat, in aiding and abetting his camp, are trying to put out there. Like, the idea that this is that he can just force his way there is, it's just false. It's not the case. He may well end up there, and I would still say that they are the leaders, but they don't have enough in a two-way deal with Portland. Clearly, they don't have what Portland wants, And so they need other teams. And the fact that they even need other teams means this is going to be complicated, which means it may not happen. And in the end, the Trailblazers are going to do what's best for the Trailblazers. And there is no consequence for sending Damian Lillard somewhere other than the Heat. There really isn't. We could pretend there is. We could put a bunch of smoke out there about how how are people going to feel? They will trade him where they get the best package. And as long as that team is comfortable with the idea that Damian Lillard will play for them, and he will. You know why? Because he's not Ben Simmons. I'm sorry to bring that up, Nets fans, but he's not Ben Simmons.
We'll talk about him later. And he's a good guy. I think everything's going to work out fine there. But on that point, is this kind of have then a little bit of the Paul George, the 1 year stop in OKC potential kind of energy where it's like, yeah, we're going to trade for him. He doesn't want to be there. We'll see. Maybe we can sell him. And that seemed to come dangerously close to Paul George saying, you know what? I do like it here. Now, he ultimately moved on, but could you see the 1 year stop for Damian Lillard here potentially?
Even more so, and I brought up that trade yesterday on Locked On Heat. I brought up that and several others. In fact, a lot of players, Carmelo Anthony, Chris Paul, a lot of guys who didn't want to end up in Oklahoma ended up in Oklahoma. That was a weird coincidence when I was reaching for examples. But, Kawhi Leonard obviously didn't want to go to Toronto.
Right.
Like this happens. And you know what? Unless your name is Ben Simmons, everybody else just plays. Now, I'm not saying Ben Simmons did that in relation to a trade. I'm saying Ben Simmons is the only modern player I know of who was willing to just burn his contract, sit out, rather than play for a team that he didn't want to be with. Damian Lillard is a consummate professional, loves the game, and has had an incredible career, is one of the all-time greats. Damian Lillard is not going to say, I didn't want to be in Utah, I'm just not going to show up. Like, it's not going to happen. Or he's going to sulk. Again, he's not James Harden. There are players who will just do whatever it takes to make people uncomfortable to get somewhere else. And then there are consummate professionals like Damian Lillard. Lillard's not built that way, and everybody knows it. So the idea that he is somehow, I have no doubt they are trying to leverage everything they've got to get him to Miami because that's where he prefers to be. It doesn't mean it's automatic that's going to happen. Anyway, so I've thought all along the Nets should be in on this, by the way. There are three paths the Nets could take this summer. And you and I talked earlier in the summer, I think, earlier in the offseason. Now that they had, Bridges and Johnson and all these, some guys who with a lot of overlap, and what are you going to do with it all? There was the go all in version, which would mean like making a trade for a Dame Lillard and let's just try to be as good as we can immediately. There's the immediately just like cash out version, in which it's like, let's sell high Mikal Bridges. Send Cam Johnson out in a sign and trade, whatever, and just do a true rebuild, even though I know they don't have their own picks, but still, whatever. There's another way of just kind of deciding to like hit a complete reset or close to it, 90% reset. And then there's the middle path, and it looks like they're traveling the middle path. Right. We'll get to this later in the pod, but like it really looks like they're not doing the all-in thing, at least for a soon-to-be 33-year-old Dame Lillard. So that brings us back to Tyler Herro and your original question that you asked 7.5 minutes ago. There's an opportunistic element to this, right? Where, we don't want to be all in on Damian Lillard. We don't think it's the right play for us at this stage. We're going to do more of a methodical approach here and be opportunistic, but not go all in on somebody whose window might only give us a couple of years. And plus, maybe there's still a little bit of PTSD for this organization from all-in trades for Pierce and Garnett, even though it was a different ownership and a different GM. All-in moves for Katie and Kyrie, which just ended, right? Maybe it's kind of a, let's just do it a little differently this time. And so Tyler Herro picking him up as a third party in that deal, I've heard that they do have some interest, and I do think he makes some sense.
Yeah, it's interesting to see because at a minimum, we've said on the show that 23 years old, and a lot of people look at the number, and oddly enough, now Cameron Johnson is a handful of years older, but what we thought would have been a breaking point when you got to 25, 26, 27 million a year on an AAV for Cameron Johnson, we thought we would have been disgusted by that number. And then by the time it came and you saw other contracts in free agency, you kind of went, oh, no, this is probably going to end up settling into an area where you really don't mind it. And that's even to an even better extent when it comes to Tyler Herro. Yeah, he's making 27 million. Okay, he's 23 years old. Like the prime isn't there yet. And that's really why I asked the question, because whether or not you think Tyler Herro is going to be a part of the long-term future for the Brooklyn Nets, he can at least be a part of the next 2 years before, as we've discussed previously, maybe you decide this didn't work out. We are going to move Mikal Bridges. We are going to move Cameron Johnson. We are going to blow this up. You just have more assets. And I still think the Nets are threading that needle of wanting to be competitive and also wanting to have valuable assets in their organization over the next couple of seasons.
And if I'm looking at this just on a short-term window, right? Tyler Herro is easily movable again, I think. His contract is fine, especially in an expanding. Like, we have two things happening simultaneously. We have expanding salary cap because a new TV deal is going to come in a couple of years, but we also have tightening overall in the system because of the new CBA. So sometimes it's a little bit hard to judge, but I do think Tyler Herro's contract will be very movable. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Short term, plugging in Herro next to Bridges, Johnson, Claxton, everybody else, that's a pretty good team. That's a team that should make the playoffs. Without Herro and with the moves they made so far, are they a playoff team? I'm not sure. So short term, it keeps you in the mix, I think, competitively. And then if you don't see him as a full-time or a permanent piece going forward, maybe move him again later. The only other concern I would have is back to the salary cap. Herro plus Johnson's new deal plus Bridges plus eventually an extension for Claxton. You're starting to get a little unwieldy.
Yeah, and I think that's the only thing that you keep an eye on here is that'll end up being north of 15, 120 million-ish kind of range for your core of four guys, and for a team that we'll touch on a little bit here later on as far as where is the depth and how can you continue to still add pieces to that. A break in the conversation with Howard Beck to tell you that this show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Sometimes in life, we're faced with tough choices and the path forward is not always so clear. For me, years ago, when I made the choice to make covering the Brooklyn Nets my career, I had to walk away from other career options that I had gone to school for, had spent money on degrees for, and at the time were far more financially viable than changing lanes. But whether it's about changing a career path that you're thinking about or relationship struggles, anything else that you have going on in your life, you know that therapy helps you stay connected to what you really want and to help you navigate life so that you can move forward with confidence and really be excited about the choices that you're making. Trusting yourself to make decisions that align with your values is like anything. The more you practice it, the easier it's going to get. You know that with BetterHelp, if you're thinking about starting therapy, this is the one that you want to give a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist, and know that you can switch therapists at any time at no additional charge, because BetterHelp is about helping you improve in the areas of life that matter. And that also comes down to the people that you talk to. They're going to help navigate some of those decisions. Let therapy be your map with BetterHelp. You visit betterhelp.com/LockedOnNBA today and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. The other quick note before I ask you the Ben Simmons question, because how could you not, is if not Tyler Herro, if not the Miami Heat 3-team deal, should the Brooklyn Nets, or are you hearing any sentiment of the Nets are willing to be in any 3-team trade discussions as that third party? Because I'll use the Karl Anthony Towns as the example, just because it seems like they've made some huge mistake there, having that many centers and maybe not full functionality on their roster. If ever they were to move him, I looked at, and this is what Nets fans would never want to hear, a guy like Mike Conley, where you go, wow, that's $24 million, but on an expiring contract. So the one path here of Tyler Herro and a lengthier deal, now he's a part of this team, at least for the short-term future, versus a guy like Mike Conley that you turn around and say, well, he solves a short-term need. He's a veteran, experienced, traditional point guard. And he's off the books in a year. So when you go to bring back Nicholas Claxton, you don't find yourself potentially in a financial logjam. Do deals like that or situations like that seem appealing, or should they be appealing to the Brooklyn Nets?
Without addressing that one specifically, and I love Mike Conley. Everybody in the league loves Mike Conley. Everybody in the league would love to have him. And, look, when that contract runs out, the next Mike Conley deal is probably going to be a lot less. And if you're the team that has his bird rights and he's got a comfort level there, actually it's not a bad play. But I think Minnesota really needs him too.
Yes.
for the time being. I think the Nets. I think if there's nothing else we can conclude right now, and I could wake up tomorrow, or we could stop taping, and I could find out that I've been proven completely wrong. It seems pretty clear that they are going to be methodical about whatever this next phase of their team is, right? They are far from done. This is far from a complete team. This is far from, as I've pointed out many times since the deals, you wouldn't plan to construct a team this way. They do have a lot of overlapping parts, right? So if some people go, this roster makes no sense. Of course it doesn't make sense. You had gun at the head, made 2 superstar blockbuster trades within days of each other in February. This is the time that you're supposed to sort that out. I feel to me like they're still kind of trying to figure out how to sort it out. And part of that is Ben Simmons is clogging up the books. Part of that is that we'll get to this later, but they've got some pieces that I think still make sense to trade that they haven't dealt yet. Opportunism is going to be my buzzword. They're going to be opportunistic, I think. If they can facilitate Lillard to the Heat and they get what they want out of it, they'll do that. If they facilitate in a Karl-Anthony Towns trade, but not as a destination for Towns, I don't see that they would necessarily want to be in the Karl-Anthony Towns business. But if they can facilitate that, I could see that. And if all else fails, they do have some ancillary pieces, I think, that they can flip at some point.
So then, and I agree with you, because that's the first thing was once the possibility of just Damian Lillard in general came up, then it was, well, look at any star that maybe could get traded and say they should go to Brooklyn. And that just seems to always be far further away from a real possibility for Brooklyn than the other options of being involved. If they get into one of these trade talks, Ben Simmons, $37 million. Now, we've talked before that the contract is looking better and better as far as it being a real detriment to a cap in the short term, because you're only now 2 years away from it being off the books. Maybe it's not as bad as it once was. Still $37 million. Should the Nets be inclined to try to shed that in one of these deals that gets them Tyler Herro, or should they still be willing to hold out and wait to see what this player potentially could be if he comes back on? Because my latest revelation on this was, I don't know for sure if Ben Simmons was ever a player the Brooklyn Nets really wanted to have on their roster, almost regardless of the money. I mean, if it had been a lower number, maybe that'd be different. But remember, they had to match the James Harden money. Like, that was a part of that forced out trade. It doesn't mean you can't like what his skill set could be, but this, again, does feel like the theme for the Brooklyn Nets over the last handful of seasons, being forced into decisions rather than actively making a choice.
Yeah, for sure. They would have much rather had, James Harden, Kyrie Irving, and Kevin Durant, and hopefully all of them playing, right?
If we're going ideal, yeah, I'll take the 3 superstars.
But when Harden was the first one to pull the ripcord, and the most logical deal out there was to flip him for Ben Simmons, who at that time wasn't that far removed from being all NBA. Yep. And everybody had reason to believe that he just needed to get a change of scenery, get his body right, and he'd be fine, and he'd be that guy again. Well, he's not that guy now. And across the league, I think there's just a lot of skepticism that we're going to see that guy again. And if that's the case, that's a lot of money to have invested in essentially a role player, a backup 5, as he was at the end of last season for the Nets. So the problem with the problem with looking at Ben Simmons as a piece of trades, right, as something that you would send to Portland in a Dame Lillard deal, or send to trying to think of who else is out there. You're not sending him to Philly in a eventual Joel Embiid deal. That would be funny, though.
I got a player for you. I think he's a 1-to-1 replacement. He can play the 5, and he can also handle the ball.
Also, he knows your city very well.
He knows it intimately.
Definite comfort zone. You're looking out on the horizon and you're saying, is Joel Embiid going to be available at some point? And the Nets have a boatload of picks to get involved in any of these. Again, this is why I think they're going the patient route. Maybe Giannis sours if the wheels fall off in Milwaukee. This is what the whole league, by the way, is thinking. This is how everybody thinks all the time. Everybody's a bunch of vultures. If you're looking at Dallas and saying, if Kyrie derails the Mavericks, or if they didn't do it, you're going to keep an eye on Luka. The whole league is looking at it this way. The Nets are one of the teams now that has a boatload of picks, and especially those Suns picks, which should be highly valuable. And you're thinking, we got to, keep our powder dry. We'll figure out when to go all in. I bring that up in relation to Ben Simmons because Ben Simmons is a negative asset, And if the Portland Trailblazers, for instance, were saying, hey, you guys want to do Dame? And the Nets said, yeah, look, for salary matching purposes, Simmons should be central to this deal. The Blazers are going to be like, all right, it's going to cost you at least a first round pick just to take on Ben Simmons. Right. He has a negative asset. You have to induce us to even take him. And then more picks to make up for the Dame Lillard part of it. So is that the best way to spend a first round pick or more? Is to use it just to get somebody to take Ben Simmons, when, to the point that you and I have both made, there's only 2 years left. And since the Nets don't have an urgency right now to win immediately, they're in a pseudo rebuild, a partial rebuild, whatever it is, then they're the ones who can kind of afford to just say, you know what, we'll pay Ben Simmons to keep working on his game, working on his body, working on his head, see if he can get back to the player he was. And if he does, great, we benefit. And if he doesn't, you know what, in a couple of years he walks, or we send him out in a cap clearing move, for some other team takes on the expiring contract if they need to clear cap, and that's it. But I don't. There's no market for Ben Simmons. It's if he ends up getting folded into a deal, I'm sure the Nets will be thrilled. But there's just no market for him.
And that's where we had said, if they could. Yeah, they should, right? Just to be done with it, just to be done with the money and to know it's off of there. But to your point, there's also no pressure for the Brooklyn Nets right now to feel like you need to clear that space. All right. And we finally get to turn our attention to what the Brooklyn Nets have done in free agency. It's not like they just sat there and didn't pick up anybody, even if they weren't the highest profile names. The first of which was Dennis Smith Jr., which of course was a guy that Doug and I listed and said, I don't think that's really someone you want to pursue. It doesn't really fit, doesn't have the skill. They'll pick him up. And then they also grabbed Lonnie Walker IV, who we didn't even really think about being on the radar necessarily. When we look at those two additions, though, and specifically with Dennis Smith Jr., it was reported, and I think this is always a fun one for franchises, for organizations to say, that he was a priority for the Brooklyn Nets going into free agency. I'm not putting down Dennis Smith Jr., but I never thought I would hear priority in his name in free agency necessarily going together. Was that what the Nets wanted to set out to do? Did you hear anything going into free agency where it was the Nets maybe had higher level targets, guys that you were waiting to see how the market developed for them, and always had kind of these safety net decisions that they knew they could make, obviously with where they are financially?
I look at this as, if the Nets are looking at this as, we're a team that needs to just start taking some swings again. We're back to a higher class version of the, first Sean Marks, Kenny Atkinson years. Mm-hmm. They've got a much better starting point because they have Bridges and they have Cam Johnson and they have Nick Claxton and they have Spencer Dinwiddie again. They no longer have Joe Harris. But they need Dennis Smith Jr. to be their new Spencer Dinwiddie alongside the old Spencer Dinwiddie. And Lonnie Walker IV maybe is the new Joe Harris or whatever. He's somebody, fill in the blank. They're taking some swings on guys who don't cost much, who are still young enough in their careers that they could figure it out. Dennis Smith Jr. obviously was a top 10 pick not that long ago. He's was enticing to scouts at the time of that draft, and then enticing to the Knicks who thought he was going to be a centerpiece kind of player when they acquired him in the Porzingis deal, because he had this crazy athleticism and he's a point guard who can get to the rack, but he had some very selfish tendencies early in his career. He's recast himself as this defensive dynamo, and the rest of that stuff is still there, lingering somewhere. So, like, is there still a complete version of Dennis Smith that will come into focus? And if you're the Nets and you have nothing to gain or lose, and you don't have any urgency to win at a high level right now, why not be the team that says, hey, come on in. We've got a great cast of players. Like, Dennis Smith Jr. doesn't have to overdo it with a Nets team that has Bridges and Johnson and Dinwiddie and other people generate offense.
And that's why I actually think, and as we came through it, you look in the backcourt and you just say, hey, they got better. They brought in younger players. They brought in guys that maybe still have something more to their game that they can explore. And this is the kind of team that is appealing to those players. Come in, work on your game. There isn't a pressure to be X or Y. We can just see how you develop and how you can impact this roster in a positive way. So in the end, Doug and I were both positive on these pickups, but it was just fascinating to come into it. You pick up another $19.9 million TPE with the moving of Joe Harris. We know you can hold that all all the way through the trade deadline of the upcoming season. But you have all this money, and it always comes back to, TPEs, MLEs, they get spent far less often than they get spent around the NBA. So you can't start to dream on the idea of using all of that money again, especially where the Brooklyn Nets are currently. The other part of this offseason then, and coming out of the draft, was Sean Marks and the price point that he made for Dorian Finney-Smith and Royce O'Neal. It seemed to be that he set such a high price point that everyone around the league said, well, no, we're not giving you that much draft capital. You're not going to be able to make a move up the draft board by packaging them. Do you think that's intentional? That Sean Marks was like, based on where we are, it actually behooves us to still have Dorian Finney-Smith and Royce O'Neal, at least in the short term. Either one of these guys could still get moved, and the Tyler Herro deal at the top, like we talk about, that could end up playing a big factor in all of this. But it just seems like they set the bar just high enough so that they could come out of this and still have a veteran starting power forward if they need him. Still have a versatile player in Royce O'Neal, knowing, I'll use a Howard Beck here, I could wake up tomorrow and they could be traded and they could be totally different.
I would just say, I'll do my best Sean Marks mind reading right now. One, as we've established, no urgency to do anything really. They don't have to trade anybody. They don't have to get much better, frankly. Like they're just seriously like. No,
I know you're right. It's true.
There's this kind of like momentary. You can't play that card forever, but we're still in the wake of these major trades where you had to tear down a plausible contender in the middle of a season. They don't have to do anything immediately. They do have a surplus of 3-and-D wings, of wings in general, of guys who play somewhere between the 3 and the 4, 2, 3, 4. Like there's a glut. You certainly want to, clarify that eventually so that your coach can settle on a rotation in which you don't have too many guys griping about their roles or their minutes. I don't think this is a mistake. Again, I'm mind reading here. I don't think it's a mistake that Sean Marks is driving a hard bargain, because look at the market this summer. This was a crappy free agent class, right? Like, and even the best names that were in this free agent class all stayed put.
Right.
Point being that when the music stops on free agent musical chairs, a lot of teams are going to still be looking at their rosters going, crap, we really need a 3-and-D wing.
Yeah.
And there just weren't that many out there. The Nets have more capable 3-and-D wings than were on the entire free agent market probably. So they're going to be able to get, I think, a nice return if and when they decide to trade Royce O'Neal and or Dorian Finney-Smith or anyone else. They're in a good position because those guys are really valuable, and there are a bunch of teams that do have urgency to compete at a high level, and especially some contenders who are going to look out and go, you know what? We still got a hole to fill. Where are we going to find it? And they're going to be calling Sean Marks, and I think Sean Marks is going to be able to get a good deal.
Last one before we let Howard Beck go. The 5 position is a fun one for the Brooklyn Nets. And this is NBA level. The NBA free agent class at the center position just didn't seem to offer a lot of really strong options. There's guys the Nets fans have been in love with and been waiting for, like Mo Bamba. He signed with Philadelphia. Like, in this same kind of vein of being patient, of taking flyers on guys, I kept naming, go steal Paul Reed on a restricted free agent for the Philadelphia 76ers. Look at a guy like Jay Huff. Look at your 7 from down in Miami. Like, just look at guys that could be something for you and that don't cost anything to bring in the door. Have you heard anything, maybe specifically or in general on the center position? But the biggest one was always Christian Wood, and he seems to have a personality that rubs everyone the wrong way. Is that just the nature of what happened for the Nets and why they haven't addressed that position of need, even from a depth perspective? You look at this roster, yes, they have a lot of wings, but you're still sitting here saying it's Nicholas Claxton and it's Day'Ron Sharpe, and it's the theoretical impact of Ben Simmons were he ever to get back on the court.
I just think that the way was given the market and given the center market, as you just pointed out, it's not the kind of thing that you're rushing out to do. And the fact is, like, all right, Christian Wood, multiple teams now have tried the Christian Wood experience and haven't, enjoyed it that much. And the Mavericks paid a decent amount to do so. I've talked to Christian Wood a couple times. I've enjoyed Christian Wood. I like him, but I haven't had to be his teammate. So that's different. I don't think it's necessarily his personality so much as it is his game that grates on teams, and so, in particular his defense or lack thereof. I mean, listen, at the end of all this, again, the musical chairs game, probably some team that has some exception to spend or cap room to spend will give Christian Wood something, modest but above the minimum. But if they don't, maybe he's one of those guys who, every year there's a couple of guys you go, wow, I can't believe that guy's still out there. And some team swoops in and gets him on a nice team-friendly contract in the late stages of free agency. Maybe that's the guy. I don't want to go too deep on Christian Wood and the Nets, but like maybe it's somebody else. I just don't think it's that high of a priority, especially in an NBA where, probably your starting center is going to be your typical 6'10", 6'11", 7 feet and up kind of guy, and then your backup center is Grant Williams or
right.
It's somebody, it's a 6'6" to 6'8" dude, or it's Dorian Sharp. It's probably not a point of urgency on a team that again is just kind of looking at where are we going to fall in the 6 to 10 range of the East, right? 7 to 10 range maybe.
The Brooklyn Nets fan base will love hearing that maybe the center position just isn't a big priority. Maybe that's just not something that's high on their list. But I agree with you. I agree with you because I think correct me if I'm wrong, but the point is like the upper echelon of centers, of guys in starting 5 lineups that play there. Those are those guys, right? Yeah. The Joel Embiids of the world. When it gets to the second unit, it's just kind of, hey, you need a body that can do certain functional things for you. Teams that have extra guys that are a little bit bigger, yeah, they beat up on your second unit a little bit, but it's pretty marginal as far as where the Nets could truly improve relative to maybe running out, another dirty word for Nets fans, small ball lineups and just trying to spread the floor out a little bit and be functional with whatever players you have for this season that you're going to have.
We're long past the days of we've got to have a 7-footer starting and a 7-footer behind him in case of emergency or to play in the second. It's not the case anymore. Most teams are going to go with some combination of traditional-ish lineup and small ball lineups. And Nick Claxton has become one of the better centers in the league. So cool. You're already ahead of the game. You're going to play him his 35, 36 minutes. And then, you fill the rest with whoever. I just don't think it matters that much. I wasn't aware this was such a hot button issue in Nets fandom world, but to me, it's kind of low on the list of things that I think are important for the Nets to do this offseason. But
that's really it's really interesting. I think to me, it's always been the long-term thing that they've never had kind of the solve, right? We've always been a smaller roster over the last handful of seasons. You never have a guy you can rely on. So sometimes maybe the less important thing feels like the more important thing because it hasn't been addressed the way you're hoping to, or even at any level. But I like that. I like the optimism of just saying, hey, Nicholas Claxton and Day'Ron Sharp, and maybe you add someone, you take a flyer on somebody, but that you can still function like that.
I mean, listen, if we were having the same conversation back in January, maybe I'd have a little bit different answer, because at that time you're trying to make a deep playoff run and get to the finals before the whole thing implodes. So at that time, having another center to spell Claxton, somebody who's maybe a little stronger, who can deal with Embiid, and who can deal with, there aren't that many other big bodies, a Jonas Valanciunas, a Steven Adams, a Jokic, obviously, there are teams that you have to deal with at some point where Claxton's not the ideal matchup. When you're trying to be a contender, that is a really vital question. When you're just in this middle stage that they're in now, I just don't know that it's as urgent. You still don't want Claxton to get beat up, but it's just not as big a deal to me. Also, by the way, again, Ben Simmons, I know does not cast himself as a traditional big or a center. He finished the season essentially as the backup 5, right? So I think he's going to enter the season probably in a similar capacity, unless we see some incredible transformation in the offseason. Considering the amount of money they have invested in him, getting 15 minutes a game out of him, including a bunch at backup 5, is probably a decent way to use that.
Howard Beck paving the way for a successful return for Ben Simmons to the court for the Brooklyn Nets, and a lot of other
Ben Simmons.
That's as we all knew that he would be. I mean, that was the original plan I think, when he came into the league.
Sure.
Howard Beck, we obviously appreciate your time. And as this is the final broadcast of Howard Beck's illustrious career, you're not going to hear him anywhere else. I think he's done writing. He's done broadcasting. You'll never, he's retiring from the game. When you're at the top, Howard, why bother looking for the next peak to climb? No, we've appreciated a handful of conversations over the past month or so, a little bit more than that, giving some insights from the NBA level. And it's been absolutely awesome. So thank you so much for making time for us and being so accessible, and hopefully giving Nets fans a little bit of a bird's eye perspective, because it's very easy to get caught in the emotion of following your team and wanting them to improve this second right now. The process is a little bit longer for Brooklyn, and hopefully a good one.
Appreciate it, Adam. Thanks for having me again, and we will certainly see you down the road.
And that, my friends, is another great discussion with Howard Beck. Obviously, as we said, always appreciative of his time. And there are some things I think that come up there, right? Where the Brooklyn Nets fit into this timeline for other teams and moves that they want to make. It still always comes back to patience. And maybe making a deal where you end up with Tyler Herro does start to marginally shift your timeline. Interesting to see how it impacts the way they look at certain players on this roster. Dorian Finney-Smith, Royce O'Neal, are they coming and going in a scenario like that? And let's not forget, Cam Thomas is going to be front and center in a decision like this. When you already have Lonnie Walker and you already have Dennis Smith Jr. on this roster, you have to look at a guy like Cam Thomas with a potentially incoming Tyler Herro, a guy that's going to be on ball. Where does he fit in that hierarchy? So things are certainly fluid in Brooklyn, and that's something that you can expect from us going into next week, going ahead and fleshing out where this roster currently stands, and then looking at that 5 spot. Howard Beck, take his path forward here. It doesn't matter. Little Nicholas Claxton, a little Day'Ron Sharpe, maybe a nibble around the edges on some other options on the free agent market, but is it a necessity for the Brooklyn Nets to have that depth, to have that consistency when you plan on running your starters 35 minutes a night throughout the regular season? You got to be over on YouTube to hear that conversation, and on the podcast feed. Make sure you have those alerts turned on so you don't miss any of the content. Doug would always tell you, man, have we just been absolutely elated by the numbers that we've seen over there. We are going to continue to cover Summer League, which is also kicking off, and seeing a player like Noah Clowney take the court for his first official NBA level sample size. You want to be a part of all that great action as well. So do those things and support the show, and know that without any Doug Norrie here on the podcast, there is no quote short of saying I miss my friend, and I can't wait until he's back so we can keep talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.